Okay. At inState, we are a student-run social mobility organization. So our aim is to have students, give them professional development and help them achieve their dream corporate careers. So this is what we're doing here today. We're going to be running a consulting event with Cases for Good. And what we really want to do is tell you about the key skills you need to tackle a case interview, and then we're going to give you an opportunity to tackle an interactive case interview. I highly recommend all of you get involved, answer the questions, because you're going to have a great opportunity to have feedback from incoming consultants from top strategy firms. So this is a very great opportunity for you. And if you can, keep your cameras on because we're all nice to each other's faces, be engaged, but no worries if not. And I'm going to hand it over to Isaac and Ablai to take it forward.
Cool, thanks Omar. So thank you everyone for joining. I think if you could share the screen. Yeah, so as Omar said, I think it would be great if you guys could turn on your cameras and stay engaged for the session, because there's plenty of opportunity to practice case interviews with us. So this is an exclusive event for inState, and we just hope that you enjoy. So just to quickly introduce the team. So who are we? We're basically fresh individuals at university. So I'm Isaac. I'm studying a chemical engineering degree at Cambridge, and I'm a founder at Cases for Good as well. So I'll let Ablai introduce himself.
Hey guys, wait, sorry, I have a problem with my audio, I think. Just a second.
We can hear you.
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, so my name is Ablai. I co-founded this with Isaac. I'm currently doing a master's at Oxford, and Isaac and I are joining the same firm in autumn, and we just thought this would be a good opportunity to share the knowledge and skills that we've gained so far in our preparation. So hopefully you enjoy today's session. So I'll let Michelle and Natalie introduce themselves now.
Hello, my name is Michelle. I'm studying economics at University of Aberdeen. Thank you all so much for coming, and I hope that you'll find today's session useful. So I'll pass it on to Natalie as well.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming today. My name is Natalie, and I'm second year studying chemistry at Imperial. I really hope you guys find the session useful and insightful as well. And really thank you to inState team for giving us this opportunity to support you guys. So I think without further ado, I'll pass it back to the speakers.
Cool, yeah. So Michelle and Natalie are basically like the backbone, so supporting me and Ablai throughout. So they do incredible work. So who are we essentially? We are a bridge between three entities, right? So we're credible individuals that really want to give back to society in terms of consulting. And there's charities that definitely need financial assistance. So there's also you, highly driven, aspiring consultants that wish to break into consulting. And we are essentially connecting those three entities together. And that's how Cases for Good was founded. So just a bit of disclaimers. I think Ablai will just run through these with you.
Yeah, so some disclaimers, right? So all advice is our own and is not affiliated with any firms that we're part of, we've been part of, or we're going to join, right? Essentially, it's everything, all the advice is given to the best of our knowledge. It's not a model answer, it's not a perfect answer, it doesn't guarantee you an offer, but this is just, these are just examples and answers that we would give in your situation, and it worked out for us, so hopefully it will work for you as well. Any funds that we normally raise do not go to our personal benefits. They all go to the charities. So we don't personally collect any money. If you were to join our future events, perhaps we wouldn't be collecting any of your money. So this is all purely for just impact, no profit. Yeah, you can take this opportunity to just follow us. You can go to our website, Facebook page, LinkedIn. We post all of our updates there. On our website, you can subscribe to our newsletter as well, where we post regular updates and content and stuff. There's also a form that we would like you to fill in. You can do it during the break or at the end. So we'll have this slide open again later on. So you can scan the QR code or just copy the link. And for all of those that fill in the form, we'll send a bit of content as well, which is Intro to Consulting as a Career.
Yep, so just quickly going through the agenda. So Ablai and me will sort of give like a skills lecture of the top 6 case skills, mostly led by Ablai, and I'll chime in as well, time to time. We'll have a short break just before the juicy case study, which we'll go through with you. And during the case study, there's definitely a lot of opportunities to volunteer and basically test out your consulting skills and improve them. So just a bit of, just to again go through my profile. So studying at Cambridge, and these are some of the internships and work placements that I've done just throughout my university years. So I co-founded an initiative, Cases for Good. Some of my interests include, kayaking, cooking, and I also love basketball. So yeah, I'll be joining a strategy consultant firm in London as well. And we just don't want to really disclose it at the moment because we just haven't cleared through with HR, but you can definitely check it out on our LinkedIn pages.
Yeah, so same for me again, what I've done before. I studied at Cambridge with Isaac. Then now I'm at Oxford doing a master's, and these are the internships I've done. So I was at PwC in audit for a bit. Then I was a part of a startup. Then I did a couple of projects about consulting and engineering in my past as well. So my interests include playing the guitar, cooking, and I also follow motorsports. I'll be joining the same firm as Isaac. And again, you can see on our LinkedIn which firm we'll be going to. But yeah, we'll basically be together for a while now. Cool. So before we dive in, please stay engaged, cameras on if possible, especially in this event. There's not that many people, so I think it's a really good opportunity for you guys to get engaged. Our last event had 160 people. It was kind of, the value was really spread out, but in this case, you guys can get a lot of value by just staying engaged and volunteering for questions and keeping your camera on. When not speaking, please mute. I'm sure you all know this by now. Raise your virtual hands for any questions. Don't just put it in the chat, but you can use the chat freely but politely to just talk to each other, to answer to some of the questions that we have, or ask us questions as well throughout the event. Okay, so let's kick this off with my lecture on case interview skills. So what you need to know about case interviews, right, is you get a prompt about a business problem that you're asked to solve as a consultant. So it's a hypothetical situation. And in order to solve this question, it can be very structured, can be really unstructured. In either case, you need to really master some key skills that will help you to solve any problem, essentially, right? So these are the skills that I've identified as the main ones. So firstly is clarification, so just understand the problem, understand what they're asking you about. Secondly is structuring, so that you can break down a very complicated question into easier subparts and then answer each part separately. Thirdly is estimation. Sometimes you get asked very vague questions about the market size of something. I'm sure you've seen those, right? Or how many golf balls can fit in a bus, stuff like that. That's a really important skill to have, how to estimate something. Numerical analysis is a major part, especially these days. You'll probably have at least one question per case where you will just get asked to calculate something based on data. It could be something complicated, could be simple. We'll go through some examples later. The fifth skill is brainstorming, is when you're presented with a problem and then you have to come up with a number of solutions in a structured manner, right? And lastly is synthesis. So synthesis is when you already have a solution, you just need to present it to the client in a very efficient and concise way, but as concise and as efficiently as possible, right? So firstly, let's go to clarification, right? So this is a really important skill that gets overlooked oftentimes because when you are a consultant working on a project, you get a prompt, you get a problem, but you really need to understand the client's needs. You really need to understand the client's background in order to answer this question effectively. The same applies in a case interview. You get a very vague question. You need to understand what exactly are they asking you, right? Clarifying questions that you ask should aim to help you target your approach more directly. You shouldn't just ask anything. You should ask stuff that's really relevant and that's really going to help you solve this problem. So something that helped me a lot during my interviews is this mnemonic, BGOT. So B stands for business model, is when you can ask questions about the business model when you don't understand it. Sometimes you get a question about a very weird industry, such as, pet insurance market, or antivirus software for macOS. You might not know a lot about it, so it's okay to ask them how they make revenue, how they make profits, stuff like that. Geography is an important one. So if you get a question about a business, it's important to understand where it's located, because there will be different issues associated with the location. For example, if it's in China, then regulation will play a much bigger role than if it is in America. The third one is objectives. I would say that's one of the most important questions, just because, for example, the client is asking you whether they should move into this market, and you're asked to provide a recommendation whether they should do it or not. Well, in order to provide a recommendation, you need to understand what the client is looking for in this case, right? Are they looking for increased revenue, increased profits? Are they looking to, better their brand image? It's important to understand the objective, and you can ask about that. The timeline is important as well. So, for example, if the client wants to, create this new product, it's important to understand how long do they expect to spend on the product such that it breaks even, right? So it's important to balance between understanding the problem and asking too many questions. I would say I would keep it under 5 usually. Obviously, it's a really rough guide, but you wouldn't want to be asking too many questions, but you also want to ask as many questions as you need to really understand the problem, right? And obviously adapt this mnemonic to the situation. Sometimes you already have geography or objectives, so you don't have to ask every question from this. So second skill is structuring, right? So it's essentially structuring is the art of breaking down the complex problem into smaller pieces. So what I have on the right here is a hypothetical question, right? So this company wants to acquire a target company, and we're coming up with 4 hypotheses that help us decide whether they should do it or not. So the company should acquire the target if, firstly, the market is attractive, the target can be successful, there are synergies, risks are manageable, right? So essentially you're turning this very vague and complicated question into 4 sub-questions that are much easier to answer on their own. So this is a really important part of the case, and it's appropriate not just for the initial part of the case when you come up with the framework, but also you can use the skill for every part, for estimation, for brainstorming. Essentially, every time you get asked the question, you can always break down the problem. The important thing here is you can always ask for 2 minutes of time, where it will just be silence, and it will be just you coming up with a tree, such as the one that I have on the right as an example, right? You draw your framework in those 2 minutes, then you present it to the interviewer, and then ask whether the framework that you came up with is reasonable or not, right? So by doing this, you're ensuring that you have plenty of time to structure the problem, and also you're ensuring that you're not proceeding with a framework that is incorrect. So a lot of the beginners often feel awkward about asking for time and just being quiet, but I just want to reiterate how important it is that you do that, because it's totally fine and they expect you to do that, right? Estimation is an interesting skill that I'm sure most of you heard about. Market estimation questions, market sizing questions, right? Usually in this case, you don't have an exhibit or data to work with. But you still need to come up with a reasonable estimation, right? So for example, I have here, what's the size of the takeaway coffee revenue? What's the size of the takeaway coffee market, right? So in order to ask a question, to answer a question like this, you can, again, take a minute or 2 to draw a framework, such as the one that I have on the slide, explain it, ask if it's reasonable, and only then do you start coming up with estimates for the branches of your tree, right? So for example, the number of cups per customer per week, what's the price for the premium coffee, for the mass market coffee. So what beginners often do is they try to solve this question together with the interviewer as they go along, and they start, throwing out some numbers, throwing out some factors to consider straight away without having thought it through, really. So again, it's important here to ask for time, come up with a tree with a structure such as this, and only then do you plug numbers into the structure to arrive at a final answer. After you reach the final figure, whatever it might be, maybe 100 million pounds per year or £1 billion per year for takeaway coffee, right? You need to sense check it, because you don't actually know whether your number is correct or not. I wouldn't assume that many people know what's the size of the takeaway coffee market, right? So you need to understand whether it's in the right ballpark at least, right? So usually what you do is you divide this figure by population, for example, and then see how much coffee spent per year is there on average in the UK, right? Or you can compare it to another figure that you perhaps know, right? Maybe you just know that the market size of tea is a certain number, then you just compare it to coffee and say, you know, this sounds reasonable. This is not too much, not too little, probably in the right ballpark. The fourth skill is analysis, right? So this is numerical analysis. So usually after looking at some exhibit or data, could be a breakdown of the population, could be a breakdown of costs, right? You might get asked to analyze it or calculate a certain metric. The important thing here is that the math is never going to be difficult. You're never going to be asked, you know, to differentiate something, integrate something. It's always going to be simple arithmetic. The point of these questions is to test how structured you are when you approach calculations and whether you make basically silly mistakes, right? So what you're trying to optimize for here is accuracy and time. So the way to do that effectively is to lay out the formula first without any calculations. So the way you would do it basically in a math exam, right? You wouldn't start plugging numbers in. You would try to simplify the problem, have an equation, simplify it, and only then would you start plugging numbers in. This is essentially what you do here as well in a consulting case interview, right? Once you have the formula, explain it, again, ask if it's reasonable, and only then start plugging in the numbers. When calculating, it's okay to run the numbers, but don't just assume that it is okay. Just ask them. For example, if you have, you know, a revenue of 149.5 million, usually the interviewer will say it's fine, just take 150 million, you know? So be mindful of that. They're also looking for the times where you optimize your calculations by rounding numbers, right? Add the comment on your result and how it relates to the initial questions. A lot of the beginners, they just, for example, calculate the total cost and then just stop there because that's what they were asked to do. But what we want you to do and what the interviewers want to see is that you comment on your result, right? So for example, you know that the revenue is 100 million and then the cost, and then you get asked to calculate the cost and you find it to be 90 million. Don't just stop at saying that the costs are 90 million. You can comment on it, say that the profit is going to be 10 million, for example, right? And is 10 million a lot or little? How does it relate to the question? Whether it's going to help you to answer the client's question or not. So they're looking for that kind of next step at the end of each calculation. Just keep that in mind. Brainstorming is a very important skill to have. I personally tend to really enjoy these questions, right? So an example of this might be, what are the ways you can grow revenue of a coffee shop, right? Usually it wouldn't be the main part of the case. It would usually be somewhere at the end. So for example, you might get asked a question of, your case might be about profitability of a coffee shop. And then you do a bunch of calculations and stuff, right? And then you come up with a solution that you need to increase revenue. And then the interviewer will ask you, so what do you think? Do you have any ideas for us to increase revenue, right? It is really tempting to jump in and start listing off ideas with no structure, right? But the point of the question is to test whether you are structured or not. So again, break down the question first, such as revenue is the volume times the average spend. So how many people come in and how much they spend on average. And then you produce ideas that target each of the branches, right? So you think of ideas that will increase the volume of customers that you get. And then separately from it, you think of ideas how to make each customer spend more, right? So this way you have a structure to your answer and you're much more likely to come up with a larger number of better ideas if you structure it well. Usually it's always good to throw in a couple of creative solutions. So for example, you know, a coffee shop can host social events for a fee. They can sell merch, you know, they can sell all these auxiliary services that might raise them revenue. So some firms really like that when you come up with creative solutions and you will be explicitly, you know, graded on that.
Yeah, I think if I could chime in a
Yep.
bit for this.
Sure,
So a good tip that I learned throughout my recruiting journey is to always be as high level as possible. So what I mean by that is, for example, in terms of growing revenue, people always think, okay, revenue would be like price and then quantity. But you could always take a step back, you know, and look at it from revenue stream perspective. So in the case of like growing revenue of a coffee shop, understand first of all the business model of the coffee shop. What do they gain revenue from? Is it just coffee or coffee and food? If not, then you could always start the first branch in terms of like the main revenue stream and then other revenue streams. Then in terms of the main revenue stream, which is selling coffee, you then break it down into price and then quantity. What this does, it essentially essentially structures your argument, and it also increases the number of ideas that you can have, like exponentially, because you're thinking in terms of revenue streams.
Yep, I definitely agree. So the better your initial structure is, the better your answer is going to be, right? So always try to come up with the best structure possible. Okay, so that's brainstorming. And lastly, we have synthesis, right? So that's usually that comes in when you've already done all the quick case questions. You kind of have an idea of all the arguments for and against the recommendation. You know, you have some thoughts already, and then you get the last question. You know, a partner walks in, he has only 5 minutes. He has only a minute, right? What would you tell him your conclusions are so far? So what beginners usually do is they try to like give a broad overview of the case, or in worst cases, they just go through the whole case again and say what they found, you know, say all the numbers, and it's all like a mumbo jumbo of numbers and figures and arguments that they found. What they're looking for here is, again, for you to be structured as possible. You can see a theme here, right? Every question you get, you need to be as structured as possible, and also to be as concise as possible, because usually the client, the partner, they don't have much time. So in order to do that, again, you can ask for some time before you present your findings. You can ask for a minute just to think. Eventually, with practice, you'll be really good at this. So perhaps you wouldn't have to have a minute. But at the beginning, I would say, especially if you're applying for summer internships, I would say it's okay to just ask for a minute of time before you come up with a recommendation, right? So these questions are testing whether you can be clear and concise, right? As I said, it's very tempting to go off on a tangent, trying to explain everything. What you need to try and do is to only focus on what you found and why, right? And how to present it is by using the Minto's pyramid principle. Like, I'm assuming since you're all in the consulting stream, you probably heard these words before, but Barbara Minto was the first female partner at McKinsey, and she was a really good, effective communicator. She came up with this structure that every consultant uses nowadays, right? So it's called a pyramid because you start with your main result. If you're asked whether the client should enter this particular industry or not, your recommendations should start with the answer to that question. So you would say, yes, the client should enter the market. And then you give reason 1, you know, the market is attractive. Reason 2, the competition is manageable. And then you explain reason 1. Why do you think the market is attractive? Oh, because it's large and it's growing quickly. And then you explain why the competition is manageable, right? Because their prices are really high and their offering is much, much better. So this way you give the recommendation, you give the reasons, you explain why your reasons make sense. That's your initial recommendation. Then you can always add next steps, because the case interview is usually 20-25 minutes. You wouldn't have covered everything. I'm sure you've had like a much better ideas in your framework that you didn't get to cover. This is the time to mention them. What would you do if you had more time? And at the very end, usually what we've done with Isaac is we've mentioned some risks, caveats to your recommendation, you know, just to self-protect your argument. So you would say, yes, I would recommend that they move in. However, we need to be mindful that there is regulation risk, there's brand image risk. So again, if I were given more time, I would consider these risks as well into my recommendation.
Yep. And,
so these are the main, yep,
let me
go ahead.
chime in for the synthesis as well. So the previous tip that I gave you, so Abba, if you could just go back to the previous slide. I think another way to really stand out from the crowd in terms of, you know, mentioning your synthesis is to actually, you could also flip risks and next steps. So you could give the risk first, and then the next step would be to basically address those risks. So if you're low on time and you're under a lot of pressure, this is a very good way to stay structured and stay composed in the interview.
Yeah.
Essentially, because you don't have to force yourself to think too much in terms of next steps.
Yep, that's a great tip. And yeah, these are the main takeaways. We've covered 6 skills really quickly. So clarification, structuring, estimation, numerical analysis, brainstorming, and synthesis. These are the main takeaways here. So this is my synthesis for you guys. You know, feel free to take a screenshot of this. And yeah, this concludes this lecture. At the end, we'll have a Q&A time, so you can ask some questions if you have them. But for now, yeah.
Don't worry about the screenshots and decks and all that. I think because we'll definitely send out the deck to whoever that showed up to this webinar, and also to whoever that turned on their video. No, I'm just kidding.
Cool. Okay.
So cool. I guess so. Now it's just a quick break time, and we would really appreciate if you could fill in any feedback form that you have now, or fill it at the end.
Yeah.
And if you fill in the feedback form, that means that we have your email. And if you have your email, then we can send you this deck. And also, we can send you another guide that is more based on intro to consulting as a career, from a career standpoint, which Ablai spent a lot of hours making it, putting a lot of effort. So it's of super high quality. It's short, but it's very sweet, and it tells you everything you need to know about getting into consulting, essentially.
Yeah, this is basically for people who joined today and they don't know anything about consulting, and suddenly we're peppering them with all these skills and cases. If you're feeling confused, you can always read this guide and have a better understanding of what you're signing up to do, basically, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, let's take 5 minutes and let's meet here at 1:33. Right.
Cool. Yeah, 1:32 probably. All right. So before we actually start the case study, I think it'd be good to gauge, the audience's level at the moment. So maybe if everyone could just type in the chat, like how many cases they've done, or like if they have any interviews coming up, just to see and gauge the audience level. Okay, nice, 0. It's always good to have beginners. 1, 0. Cool. Okay, nice. So I think it's great that we have a lot of beginners. So we'll definitely keep on mind that. Cool, Enzo, applying for internship. Thanks for turning on your camera, by the way. So the case today we're going to go through is a very different case than the normal like profit kind of case that you're going to see online, because that's the whole point of us giving these webinars, to basically differentiate our offering and give you guys more value, right? So the case book that we're going to use is essentially from Yale Student Consulting Club, but that's just a disclaimer. So just don't go searching for the answers, right? Because that's what's the point of training. Okay, so just to give you the brief, so our client, a public sector developer, has been asked by the government to essentially build a water supply network in a desert. So our client has basically asked us, whoever we are, could be McKinsey, Big Four, to whether or not we should undertake this project. So if everyone could just type in the chat, like what sort of clarifying questions would you want to asking the client. Okay, Rafiq says where for when, how big. Okay, fair enough. For when?
Yeah, a bit confused about that as well, and how big as well. Can you elaborate what you mean by that?
Yeah, so try to elaborate your clarifying questions in sentences. So
Yeah.
Jess says, what's the budget and timeline deadline? Yeah, I think that's a good question, but it could be leading towards being too specific at the moment, because what you want to be high level, especially in clarification.
Yeah,
So
because budget is one of the factors that you would consider as part of answering. So you wouldn't normally ask about a factor that you would consider, right?
Okay, so yeah, Ethan asking, geography, which desert? So would asking which desert change how you would think about the project? If I told you if it was a Sahara desert or a desert in China, like what would be the key differences there? So always think about the answers that you're getting, and whether that would help you with your structure.
Yeah, I would say which country is fair, but which desert is a bit too much. Yeah.
Does the client have any prior experience? Yeah, so that's a great clarifying question. So because essentially you want to understand what's the client's exposure, or what is their capabilities. Is this project out of the scope of their capabilities? If it really is, then they probably shouldn't undertake this project, right? Or they should if it only gives them a huge financial incentive. So Rafiq, how big is twofold? How much budget, how many users of the water stream? Yeah, I think good questions as well. So, but this is also leading towards being a bit too specific, and we'll definitely share what optimal clarifying questions we would ask. So just to move on with the case, so thank you to everyone that engaged and clarified. So these are sort of the sample questions that we thought would be good. So essentially just asking, 3 to 4 would be the key number here. I think any more than 5 is just a bit too much, like you're bombarding the client at the start. So just stick to that number of clarifying questions. So yeah, as Vas said, does our client have any exposure or experience in building these network under desert conditions? So which country definitely makes sense as well, because cultural factors, especially in a political scenario with the government, is very important. So that's something to take note of as well. Any specific targets, right? So I think no one really asked this in terms of specific targets. So what does the client want to actually achieve? So many of you mentioned the budget, which is spending, but try to think in terms of goals, right? Because that's a key thing that we want to achieve here. And we also thought that competition matters a lot, especially in governmental projects, because these projects are usually in a bidding process. So we want to know what other competition are we facing against. So cool. So if you don't have any more questions, I will just share with you what the key answers were here, additional information. So these are very good to just take note of, at the side of your any pen or paper that you have right now, because they'll be very useful as we go through the case. So the client has built water supplies in the past, but never in a desert, right? So that's a key thing to take note of. Location doesn't matter. So sometimes geography matters a lot, but in this case, not really, but it's good that you clarify anyway. And the key target here is that our client would like to start making a project within 3 years of completing the project. So that's a key metric to take note of, right? So you want to break even in 3 years, and break even just means that your essential revenue that you got from the project just outweighs the costs that you absorb. So the last point, if our client agrees, they'll be the only company. So that's great. That's a key thing to take note of as well. There's no competition whatsoever. Some specific details that we will just provide upfront, so you don't have to worry too much, is that water consumption is 1 million metric tons per year, and the rates for water usage are different as well, depending on the type of consumption. Because water, people think is drinking water, but in terms of a governmental project, there'll be drinking water, water for agriculture, water for like commercial use, like construction, that kind of things. Okay, so for the next question, it's actually like a structuring question, and it would be great if we could actually get a volunteer. So, I think for this, we'll probably give you maybe 1 or 2 minutes just to think about what factors you need to consider. And yeah, please feel free to, raise a virtual hand and we'll call upon you. And don't be sad as well. So I know that a lot of you they haven't cased before, 1 or 0 cases. So that's why it's an excellent chance right now for me and Ablai to give you feedback.
Yeah, and as you saw yourself, pretty much everyone on this call is also a beginner. So don't be scared if you think your answer, will be wrong. That's the whole point of this.
And I think if you volunteer, it's gonna essentially help everyone else, right, and move forward the webinar. So we'll just give you 1 minute from now.
Yep.
All right, so any volunteers for the structuring question? Cool.
Oh, we have one. Yep.
Okay, brave man Enzo.
So
sure,
to just start, I had my first case yesterday, actually, beforehand, nothing of that sort. And what I would now think about is we saw that our client has experience already, but didn't experience that in the desert. So I would ask what may be potential challenges in the desert. So that could be a factor. And then also, if we want to break even in 3 years, how does then the cost structure look like? And how big would the payment kind of be that the company would receive from the government when the project is completed, so that we can actually assess that a bit better. So that would be the factors that I would take into account now.
Okay, nice. So thank you for volunteering. So what I liked about your answer is that you gave off a very good vibe. So, confident, like a lot of charisma, which is very important for, consultants. The points that you raised as well. So, possible challenges as well as financials. That's also very relevant. So a key improvement that I would suggest is being more structured in saying, first of all, how many points do you have upfront? So you could say like, okay, I have 2 points. First is challenges in the desert. Second is financials. And then within financials, you break it down into the revenues and cost structures that you were concerned about.
Yeah, basically
Okay.
the factors that you've mentioned are correct. These are important factors, but you should try and put it in context a bit more, right? So start a bit high level, like we have, yeah, we'll show you later.
Yep.
And then you branch out from those high level factors into your specific ideas, right? So definitely a bit more structure could help.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then thank you for your feedback. That was also more or less what I got yesterday as a feedback. I had cool creative ideas, but the structure was lacking a little bit. So this kind of project approach, they call it.
Yeah, don't worry. I think structure really
Yeah.
comes with practice. So as long as you practice enough cases, you will automatically think in a structured way and then communicate in a structured way. So how we did it is essentially, so I know that you have the casebook answers and all that, which is crap in my opinion. So definitely no offense to Yale, but the structuring that we sort of propose is actually hypothesis driven. And this is very powerful because it essentially helps you prioritize your ideas and it's very logical. So answering the question like, should our client undertake the project? So you're basically answering the client should undertake the project if these 3 criteria are met. And these certain criteria are, first of all, the break-even point. That means that the client actually achieves the target. Secondly, is that the client has the capability to execute the project. And then finally, like risks are manageable. So these are the 3 key things. And then you could go into the first thing, breaking down profit, like, break even within 3 years into profit profile and then investment costs. And note how we mentioned profit profile, because a lot of beginner or intermediate cases, they don't mention profile. Because if it's a break-even time, you're looking across many years, a time horizon. So people just say profits, but it's essential to mention profit profile because you're looking at how the profit would vary across the 3 years. So you could look at revenue profile, cost profile. And in terms of capability, so does the client have enough like capital to actually absorb all the costs and the technical expertise, right, to build a water supply in the desert. And in terms of risks, some risks that we thought of are catastrophic risks of the like water pipes leaking or any low delay risks. Cool. So for the next question, so Abai, do you want to call in a volunteer or?
What's the next? I think the next one is the factors, right?
Correct.
Yeah, no, let's do the chat thing, I would say. So, just to understand, yeah, obviously water supply is not something that, an average person is familiar with, but try to give it your best shot in terms of what operations do you think are involved in building a water supply, right? What are the steps? What is the supply chain? What facilities do we need in order to operate a water supply? Just throw in a couple of factors that you can think of in the chat. Pipelines, legal permission, regulation, design, okay, access to labor. Okay. Yeah, cool. I mean, all good ideas. I think people interpreted it in different ways, right? Some people thought of how the water supply would actually operate once it's built. Some people thought of, what are the steps we need to undertake in order to, start this project. What we were looking for is something, yeah, transportation tools to suppliers. Yeah, that's in the right direction, right? So we were looking for in terms of like a step-by-step from a consumer's perspective, right? So how does a water supply work? You extract the water, you sterilize it, you store it, you build transport links, and then you have your treatment and recycling plan, right? So we were thinking in terms of the whole value chain of a water supply, because before you start building it, you need to understand how does it work exactly, right? So for those people that interpreted this question as, getting a legal permission, all those operational details, I would recommend that, you clarify the question first. Again, you could just ask in the chat, or in the interview, you can just ask the interviewer, what do you mean exactly by this, right? Do you mean, are we looking for how is it going to work once it's built, or are we looking for how exactly are we going to get it done, right?
Yeah. So I would say clarify in terms of operations. Like, do you mean, actual technical operations or commercial operations in terms of like a rollout strategy, right? So how I actually go through my interviews is that I actually ask the interviewer back a question, almost like every time a question is asked to me, because that's how I stay in line with what the interviewer really wants. I always clarify exactly like word by word, but definitely find a balance. Don't go overboard in terms of like, if it's obvious, just go for the answer, right? So the key thing, the question here is that don't be daunted by a foreign topic, because consultants are always put in projects that are, not aligned to their strengths or their background. The key thing is just to think in a logical manner and ask good questions.
Yeah. Yeah, if you get a question like this, they wouldn't expect you to get the answer correctly. You're not expected to know anything about water supplies. You certainly shouldn't prepare to know everything about every industry. As long as it's logical, it's fine.
Cool. So I think we could move on. So for question 3, what would be the revenue and cost structure to build the water supply? I think since we're just a bit low on time, we are just going to go through how the calculation would be done. And for this question, don't be worried, because here you're answering 2 key things and the interviewer will provide you with these exhibits. So for example, here we have costings. So the cost structure, right? Here we have some upfront costs, some fixed costs per year, and variable costs. So notice how there's 3 different types of costs, especially in a huge CAPEX project like this. And these are the consumption in terms of revenue. So how we would do it is in terms of just taking the consumption rate that we given you before, the 1 million, and then do a weighted average in terms of the price and the consumption values of the percentages. So what I mean by this is just a simple sample answer. The key thing here is just to be as structured as possible.
Yeah, so this is where the numerical analysis skill comes in that I talked about. You have a bunch of data and you need to calculate a certain number, right? In this case, it would be the revenue, the annual revenue and the annual cost. So before you do that, you need to, look at the data, understand what's even written on it. Then take your time to think of your approach first, right? So you would literally tell the interviewer, can I have a minute just to think of how I would calculate this? Once your minute is up, then you explain to the interviewer, I have the total volume. I'll calculate the average price by taking the weighted average of consumption types. Then I multiply the average price by the total volume to get the annual revenue. Do you think that's reasonable? He'll say, yes, okay, go ahead. And then you'll start calculating, using the actual numbers. And exactly the same goes for the cost structure. You would say, I'll add up all the costs across different stages of, the water supply value chain. And then this way I'll come up with annual costs. So you're outlining your structure first, then you're calculating, and then you have your answer.
So I think just to clarify, since we have a lot of people that are unfamiliar with cases, perhaps like the language that consultants use, you also have to sort of pick up as you go along. So initial cost would be the total investment cost that you need for the project. So it's like a one-time thing. Fixed cost would be in terms of on a per year basis. So not in terms of like a per water consumption basis, right? And for variable costs, is in terms of per ton. So for every ton that a consumer uses in the desert city, the client would have to pay 150. So this is the total annual cost. We just summed up the variable costs and fixed costs.
Yeah. A good way to differentiate is if if a cost doesn't change, whether you produce 1 million or a 2 million of tons of water, then that's probably a fixed cost. So something like rent, some labor could be fixed cost as well in certain situations. So that's a good way to find which costs are fixed and which costs are variable.
So quickly moving on to the fourth question, in terms of break-even point, I think since you already have the values that you were just given before, so could we just have another volunteer just to run us through how we would calculate the break-even?
Maybe let's flash the numbers again.
Yeah.
Give you some time to write them down.
So here we're calculating break-even in terms of number of years, right? Because that was the key target that we want to look at.
Yeah. Let us know if you have the answer, and how you would get to the answer as well.
Yeah, so anyone that has the answer, just feel free to, raise your hand or shout it out in the chat.
Yeah, don't worry if you think it's wrong. That's the whole point, right? So, okay, Enzo again. Sure. Yeah, go ahead, man.
So I'm just trying. So we have the initial costs, right? One time, 110 million. Then we have the annual costs summed up out of fixed costs and variable costs, 177 million. And if we calculate that together for 3 years, plus the initial costs and divide by the annual revenue, we will have 3.2. So that would mean that we would break even after 3 years and a little, probably months, maybe 2-3 months or something. That would just how I would approach it, but I'm not completely sure if that's correct.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. This is not what we've done.
Okay.
But
No, I did a mistake. I know I had the 3 years in my head, but I multiplied the annual costs by 3 years. But actually, we look at this gap of revenue, subtract the variables, and then divide it by the fixed costs, right? That would be break-even point calculation.
this is closer. This is closer, but not
Closer.
quite. Yeah.
Okay.
So what you have is you have the initial costs that you need to make up for, and then you have the annual cost and the annual revenue, right?
Mm-hmm.
So annual revenue minus the annual costs would be your annual profit, and that profit would go towards repaying the initial costs, right? So
okay, makes sense. Absolutely.
So let's show the answer.
Okay, so we had annual revenue of what again? Okay, now we see it here. 199.
199, and then we have the annual costs, which are fixed costs plus variable costs, right? So 27 plus 150, so 177. So we get our profit, which is, I don't know how many, 22. And then we divide 110 million, which are initial costs by our profit, by 22 million. So we get 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I think the key thing here is just to define what the break-even point means with the interviewer again. So that would be, number of years or number of units sold. Here, it's a bit obvious that it's in years, but always good to clarify. Then, you draw out the formula, lay it out to the interviewer, and then plug in the numbers. So always calculate numbers at the end. Make sure that you give your structure first, as Ablai said in the skills lecture before. And it's always good to mention about key assumptions as well. Consider like sensibilities and like in the answer. Okay.
Oh.
Right. So I think for this question, it's a sort of like a brainstorming question in terms of how we can reduce the time taken to break even. So it would be great if you could have like, 1 or 2 volunteers as well.
Yeah, so this should be easy for you guys to answer as well. So take a stab at this. There's no calculation involved.
Yep.
Right. So we can do it. We could have done it through the chat, but then we wouldn't hit on the main point of being structured. So we want to have like an actual volunteer to run us through their approach as well as the ideas, right? Let's have someone someone new perhaps. I mean, I don't mind Enzo, but also people don't be shy.
So if no one says something, then I would just try.
Sure, yeah, go ahead. You can try.
Okay, sure. So we just saw that we basically spread profit per year over the initial investment and then try when is this investment break even. And so the initial investment is there, right? We cannot really change it. So, but what we can change is the profit. And then what we could do is either increase our revenue or lower our cost structure in order to have more profit, and in order to then within less years cover those upfront initial costs of 110 million.
Yeah, so that's a structure, right? So you want to turn the structure into actual ideas, right? So now you've broken it down into revenue and cost. So what are your
brainstorming?
Ideas?
Was it more like
exactly.
Okay, sorry. I thought it would be the structure first, as we did it till now, that we always structure the problem first and then see.
Exactly. Yes, you do structure the problem and then you use the structure to come up with a number of ideas, right? So you broke it down into revenue and costs. So what are your ideas to increase revenue and to lower costs?
We'll flash our answer later, like what me and Ablai sort of propose. Yeah, so I think last chance to volunteer, guys.
Okay, I mean, that's fine. That's okay. If there's no volunteers, let's just show the answer and maybe explain the logic. Still useful.
Sorry, may I have a try?
Yeah, sure, go ahead. Great.
Right,
Yep.
so consider, are we still talking about the brainstorming of the how to improve the revenue and to reduce the costs?
Yeah.
All right, so considering the revenue, maybe because there is no competition, just like considering other companies, maybe when the volume is fixed, we can try to increase our costs. Oh, sorry, I mean the prices. And considering the how to reduce the costs, maybe we can try to find some alternative suppliers and improve the productivity inside our company.
Okay, yeah, fair ideas. So Enzo came up with the overall structure, then you kind of took it a bit further with revenue, which is basically volume times price, and then you said we can raise our prices or we can decrease cost. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah,
that's good.
That's it.
Okay, cool. So thank you for volunteering. I think in terms of feedback on what we liked about your answer, so definitely we like the structure in terms of revenue and costs. In terms of what you could do to improve is actually be even more structured in terms of sub-numbering your points. So for example, in increasing revenue, we can do like X amount of things. And in decreasing costs, we can do N amount of things. And list out what those things are. So what we came up with was essentially this, nice tree. So first, reducing break-even point, you can split into reducing investment costs and then increasing the average profit per year that you would get. And notice how the words are very carefully chosen in terms of average profit per year. So for reducing investment costs, we can, source for cheaper suppliers, and we could also leverage on existing infrastructure. In terms of increasing average profit per year, we could, divide them again into increasing revenue per year and then reducing total costs per year, because these are the operating costs. So for revenue, definitely you mentioned competition. So that's why we said, try to negotiate higher prices since you're a monopoly. So that's a great point that you raised. In terms of, consumption volume, it's hard to change because it's, tied to like market forces and like demand. So definitely prioritize the prices. And you could also, diversify revenue streams, apply like a premium filtration service for the government especially, and then make even more money on that. So yeah, total costs would be government subsidies and cheaper alternatives as well.
Yeah, I was going to add as well, because Enzo assumed that we can't reduce investment costs, right? But you oftentimes when you have a project that you're about to undertake, you would look into reducing investment costs, right? So it's okay to make an assumption as long as you state clearly that you're making it, and then you ask the interviewer whether it's a reasonable assumption to make. So anytime you have an assumption, just, it doesn't hurt to check, because if you don't, then the interviewer wouldn't correct you, right? So this way you won't miss out on anything if you keep checking. And here, for example, diversifying revenue streams is an example of a creative solution. For example, you could say we can offer premium filtration services so that scientists can use, extremely filtrated water. That would be an example of a creative solution.
All right, cool. So yeah, thanks to those that volunteered. So in terms of a final recommendation, I think since we're a bit low on time, so Abai, do you want to perhaps flash the answer, or do you want to get another volunteer?
Let's flash the answer. I think that would be best.
Yeah, since we sort of guided you through this case, usually you would have to form your own opinions. So for this one, since there wasn't that much information, only about the break-even time, right? So a sample answer that we come up with is that we said we shouldn't recommend undertaking the project. Firstly, because it would take more than 5 years to break even, therefore longer than the 3-year client target. But you could say that there are other ways to reduce break even, and then etc. etc. So always mention additional risks and other next steps that you need to think of at the last sentence.
Yeah, and the way to really come up with this recommendation really quickly is to always take note. After every question that we give you, you give an answer, just make a note of your answer, what you actually answered, and then your takeaways from this answer, right? So back when we asked you about the break-even point, you would say 5 years, you underline that, and you say this is too long, right? Then at the end of each question, you do that. And at the end, when it comes time to present your recommendation and you think of what to actually say, you can just look at all the stuff that you underlined, and that would be your points that you're going to make, right? And you can see here how we're using the pyramid principle. We start with the recommendation. We can't recommend undertaking the project. Then we give the reason, as it would take 5 years to break even. In this case, we only have one reason. Sometimes you have more, so you would list them. You would say break even is too long, regulation is too hard, competition is too tough. So you would list the reasons, and then you would go on to the next steps, right? So there are ways to reduce the break-even duration. We just didn't do it yet. We just brainstormed, but we didn't actually do the analysis. So that would be next steps, and then at the end we show the risks. So this is a very structured way to give recommendations.